Something woke me in the middle of the night. I tried to figure out where that voice was coming from. My heart stopped for a moment when I realized that the voice, that praying voice, was coming from under my bed. My dear community, what a pleasure to find myself with you once again. I am completely certain that tonight's stories are going to delight and surprise you, because they are fascinating and very different from one another. So no matter what your deepest fears are, the ones that keep you awake on stormy nights, tonight, you might find them here. There is no turning back now. You are already listening to Tales of the Night. Good evening, community. Thank you for your stories, to everyone who sends them in, and thank you to the team for their work. This podcast has been with me through some very difficult moments in my life, but today I want to share something that happened to me when I was 25 years old and moved to Guadalajara to complete a graduate program. When I arrived, I didn't know anyone in the city, and as tends to happen when you show up with very little money, I ended up renting a room in an enormous old house that had been divided up specifically for students. It was a beautiful old mansion. From the outside, it even looked classic. But once you stepped inside, you could tell it had been modified many times for various purposes over the years. There were hallways that ended in solid walls, stairways that had been sealed off, doors covered over with drywall, and rooms built in spaces that had clearly once been open patios and at least one storage area. At the time, only 3 of us were living there: Marina, Fernanda, and me. The owner was a man named Rodrigo, who worked in another city. I saw him twice during the entire time I lived there. Almost everything was handled over WhatsApp. He seemed to be around our age, or close to it. The strange things started with small details. Very, very small things. Items would disappear from the kitchen. Sometimes the bread would turn up on the floor in the morning, as if someone had tossed it out of its bag. Drawers would appear open, things out of place or moved. One morning, the refrigerator was left open with items on the counter. I assumed one of the girls was moving things and not putting them back because she was messy, but when I finally asked them, both of them got annoyed. They told me they had been thinking the exact same thing about me. We let it go. Then other objects started turning up in the wrong places. A hairbrush appeared in the other bathroom. Keys changed location. A jacket I had left on my chair turned up neatly folded inside my closet. They were small things. Very strange, but still explainable. Or still something we wanted to explain away. But everything kept getting worse. The first time I heard the cough was about 3 weeks after I moved in. It woke me up near 3 in the morning. It was a horrible cough, deep and rattling, the kind that comes from someone who has been sick for years. I sat up in bed thinking one of the other girls was ill, listened for a few seconds, then silence. Just silence, until it simply disappeared. The next morning I asked them both. Neither had been coughing, neither even had a cold. That was when Marina told me the story. According to her, she had heard a rumor she couldn't verify, that before the house was renovated, an older woman had lived there, and people said she practiced strange things. Witchcraft, cults, rituals, the usual things that get said about any old house. I laughed, but Marina didn't, and Fernanda was listening with complete seriousness. Both of them seemed convinced that something like that could be true. They told me they had heard her several times before I arrived. The cough, footsteps, the sound of things being moved, and that if I ever heard anything out in the hallways, the best thing was to ignore it and never come out of our rooms at night. I remember being certain they were exaggerating. Until one night I heard the praying. The first time it was barely a few words, so faint I thought I was dreaming. I opened my eyes and stayed completely still. I heard clearly the voice of a woman, hoarse, raspy, murmuring something. I couldn't make out the words, but she seemed to be praying. The worst part was that the sound was coming from below, directly beneath my bed. Not from the hallway, not from another room. Below, as if someone were lying on the floor right underneath me. I felt an absurd kind of fear, the kind that makes you feel like a child again, frozen solid. I waited. The voice continued for a few seconds and then disappeared. It took me a very long time to fall back asleep. After that first experience, I tried to convince myself it had been a dream. It didn't work, because 2 nights later I heard the praying again. Same voice, same sensation, as if someone were whispering directly beneath me, beneath my bed. They weren't prayers I recognized even slightly. Sometimes it sounded like praying, other times like someone murmuring incomprehensible words. The worst was the cough that always came first. Deep, wet, the kind that comes from someone very sick or very old. I ended up telling Marina and Fernanda what was happening to me. Neither of them seemed surprised. Marina just looked at me and said, "Well, the witch has chosen you." I still remember the anger that gave me. I told her to stop saying nonsense, that if someone had gotten into the house we needed to find out. But they kept insisting I had to either ignore it or find proper help from someone who knew about those things, the paranormal. They said we couldn't drive her out of her own house, but that someone might at least be able to help me sleep. And honestly, for several weeks I began to think that was exactly what I needed. Things kept moving. Objects disappeared. The kitchen cabinets would be found open. A glass I had left in the kitchen appeared hours later in the bathroom. My hairbrush disappeared for 3 days and then turned up again in the exact spot I had already searched several times. Then the smell began. It was hard to describe. Something between dampness, drain, and rot. Sometimes it would appear for a few minutes and vanish. Other times it soaked into certain hallways of the house. It reached a point where the 3 of us avoided walking around alone at night. And the situation got worse when Fernanda found hair. She was cleaning behind a dresser and pulled out a fistful of long, dark, tangled hair, far more than a person would ever normally shed. She called us over and we stood looking at it in silence. None of us had hair that long. None of us could explain it. There was simply no way to account for that hair. A few days later, something happened that still sends a chill through me when I think about it. I woke up in the middle of the night. I hadn't heard the cough. I hadn't heard the voice either. What woke me was something else. The sensation that someone was sitting on the bed. I barely opened my eyes. The room was dark. I saw nothing, but I clearly felt the mattress sunken down near my feet. I lay completely still, not daring to move a single muscle, not even daring to breathe too loudly. Little by little, the pressure disappeared, as if whatever it was had gotten off the bed. That night, I cried until I fell asleep. For the first time, I seriously thought about moving out. But final exams were right around the corner. I had no money, no time, no energy. I stayed. But the ending, community, came about 3 weeks later. It was almost 3 in the morning when I heard the cough again. I opened my eyes immediately. I recognized it. Then came the murmuring. The voice was there, beneath the bed, clearer than it had ever been. I remember I was exhausted. I had been sleeping badly for weeks. I was afraid. I was angry, and I simply reached my limit. I slid my hand under my pillow, grabbed the pepper spray I always kept with me, reached my arm down over the side of the bed, and sprayed it in the direction the voice seemed to be coming from. I did it without thinking, purely out of reflex and desperation. Everything went silent for a second. And then I heard a scream, a human scream, a raw, agonized sound. Then violent coughing, banging, something thrashing furiously under the bed, crawling out from under it, crashing into everything, wrenching my bedroom door open. I heard it move away down the hallway. I jumped out of bed and ran to my door. At the same moment, I saw Marina and Fernanda come out of their rooms. All three of us were pale. All three of us had heard the same thing. Then an alarm went off, loud, coming from somewhere in the house. Seconds later, we got a call. It was Rodrigo, the owner. He asked if we were all right. He told us one of the alarms had triggered on his phone and that someone had opened the front door of the house. We ran to the entrance. The front door was wide open. The police arrived shortly afterward. We told them someone had broken into the house, but what they found left us speechless. There were hidden spaces inside the house, small voids created between renovations, very narrow passages behind certain walls, improvised access points between sealed-off rooms. And in one of those spaces they found clothing, water bottles, leftover food, filth, blankets, and objects stolen from our bedrooms. A woman had been living there, inside the house, between the walls, for who knows how long. But the worst came later, much later. When Rodrigo reviewed the security camera footage from the common areas, he asked if we wanted to see some of the recordings, and all three of us said yes. We assumed he would show us something from that night, how she had escaped, how she had gotten in, where she had been hiding. Instead, he sent Marina a file dated several weeks before. It was the camera pointing at the hallway in front of our bedrooms. The recording began in the middle of the night. Everything was still, empty, normal. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then we watched as a dark section next to the built-in closet in the hallway shifted, and someone came out from it. It was an extremely thin woman, barefoot, with long, completely tangled hair. She was wearing old clothes, so worn they seemed to be falling apart on her body. We watched her walk slowly toward my door. We watched her open it. We watched her go inside. The footage was edited to show she had been in my room for at least an hour, until she came back out and disappeared again into hiding. Nobody said a word while we watched. I wanted to say something, but I couldn't. The words wouldn't come out. We asked Rodrigo to please send us the file, but he refused. He had shared it only for us to watch once, and now I understand why. If that footage had become public, no one else would ever have wanted to live there. For weeks I had believed the praying was coming from a ghost hidden beneath my bed. I believed the house was haunted. I believed something supernatural was tormenting us. And the truth was always so much worse. The praying belonged to a real woman. A woman who had been living inside the walls of that house for who knows how long, and who, on some nights, had been close enough to me to touch my face if she had wanted to. Or perhaps she did. We were never told who she was, how she had come to be there, or how long she had been living inside that house. And I'm still frightened now, living as I do in another old place like that one, with its noises, with its strange occurrences. Because if there is one thing I have learned from listening to tales of the night for years, it is that what I lived through is not the only time something like that has happened. Hello, Tales of the Night team. My name is Jaron Landa, and I'm from the state of Veracruz. I'd like to start by saying I've been following the channel since 2022, and your stories have become a tradition for me and my family. We often listen to them together, especially at night, and because of that, I've had the chance to discover many stories my relatives had kept for generations, ones that get told in the warmth that Tales of the Night creates. Because of your content, my grandparents, my aunts and uncles, and my parents have shared with me experiences that happened to them, to close family members, and to people from the communities and ranches where they grew up. Not long ago, I even had a fairly singular experience of my own that left me with many questions. But before sharing that, I'd like to begin with a much, much older story. One that has remained in my family for more than a century. It is something my paternal grandmother told me, and she in turn heard it from her own grandmother. In the early years of the 20th century, when the mountains between Cuauhtintla and Chiconquiaco were still covered in dense forest, and the roads were nothing more than paths cut through the vegetation, my great-great-grandmother Juliana Cordova was alive. She had been widowed young and had to raise her son, my great-grandfather, on her own. In those times, that alone was enough to make a woman the talk of a whole town. Yet everyone who knew her always said that Juliana seemed to care very little about what others thought. She wore long work skirts, tall boots worn down by use, a wide-brimmed hat to shield herself from the sun, and a belt where she always kept a pistol. Her trade was logging. She would spend entire days going deep into the mountains to cut trees, prepare orders, and haul materials. She knew those hills better than many of the men in the region. She could read hidden trails, find springs, navigate ravines and passes known only to those who lived off the land. It was around 1903 when something happened that was never forgotten. That morning she set out before dawn. The air was cold and damp. Fog covered the trees like a veil that barely let you see a few meters ahead. The forest was still. Not even the birds were singing. No insects, only the sound of her footsteps moving through wet leaves. Juliana walked for a long while until she reached a remote area of the mountains, where even the trails began to disappear into the vegetation. That was when she heard the first blow. An axe strike. Dry, heavy, in the distance. She stopped to listen. A second blow came, then a third, and nothing more. Juliana frowned. She had spent years working among trees. She knew perfectly well what a logging day sounded like. No man could fell a large tree with only 3 strikes. But just a few seconds later, the entire forest shook with the thunder of an enormous tree crashing down through the brush. It made no sense. Juliana felt an immediate unease. Something inside her told her not to keep walking. Instead of moving forward, she slowly crouched down and took shelter behind a thick tangle of brush. She parted some branches and waited. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then she heard something moving through the fog. Footsteps, slow and heavy, very heavy, not belonging to any animal. Each step accompanied by the sound of dry leaves and branches being crushed under an immense weight. And then a figure emerged slowly through the mist. First the head appeared, then the shoulders, then the rest of the body. Juliana went completely still. It was a man, or at least it had the shape of a man. But it was too large. Far larger than anyone she had ever seen in her life. She estimated it must have stood over 3 meters tall. It was dressed in manta cloth. It wore sandals. And over one shoulder rested an enormous axe that looked as heavy as a tree trunk. Yet it carried it as if it weighed nothing. Across its chest it carried a thick rope, and at the end of the rope walked a black goat. Large, silent, eerily silent. You couldn't even hear the sound of its hooves. The figure moved without hurry, without looking to either side, as if it knew every corner of that mountain perfectly, as if there was nothing in the world that could surprise it. Juliana felt a chill run through her entire body, but although she had never seen it with her own eyes, she knew immediately who it was. She had been hearing stories about it her whole life, stories the elders told on dark nights, stories children listened to in silence and that adults avoided discussing too openly. Was it Juan del Monte? Some described him as a guardian of the mountains. Others said he protected the springs and the oldest trees in the Sierra. There were those who claimed he helped travelers who had lost their way, but everyone agreed on one thing. The best thing was never to cross his path. Juliana did not move. She didn't even dare shift her position. The enormous figure passed right in front of her hiding place. Close enough that she could hear the creak of the leaves under its sandals. Close enough to make out the rough texture of the cloth it wore. Close enough to confirm that what she was seeing was real. The goat kept walking behind it, silent, without making a single sound. For a few seconds, Juliana had the impression that the figure had paused. She wasn't entirely sure. Perhaps it was an illusion, perhaps not. But she felt that the giant had turned its head slightly toward the spot where she was hiding, as if it knew perfectly well she was there, watching it. Juliana felt her heart stop. She gripped the handle of her pistol tightly. She needed something to hold on to, even if she had no intention of using it. The figure stayed still for just a moment. Then it continued walking. It climbed a slope covered in fog. The goat followed, and little by little both of them disappeared among the trees. The mist swallowed them. For a long while, Juliana remained hidden. She didn't know how long. Perhaps minutes, perhaps a full hour. The only thing she would remember afterward was the silence. A very particular silence, as if something had passed through that place and left an invisible mark behind it. Finally, she came out of her hiding place. She looked toward the trail where the figure had disappeared. Then she looked toward the spot where she had heard the tree fall. There was no felled trunk, no fresh clearing, no sign of any logging. Nothing, as if the sound had never existed. Juliana decided to go home, and although she continued working in those mountains for many years afterward, she never went alone into that part of the Sierra again. Much later, when my grandfather was already a grown man, she told him what had happened, as a lesson, as something he needed to know. She tried to put into words something she had never been able to explain, and for the rest of her life she told the story in exactly the same way, never changing a word, never adding a single detail. Even today, in some communities between Cuauhtzintlá and Chiconquiaco, there are people who say they hear 3 axe strikes in the early hours of the morning. 3 blows, dry, powerful, and precise, followed by the thundering crash of an enormous tree falling through the brush, a tree that no one ever manages to find afterward. My grandmother always said that the mountains are far older than we are, far older than any person, and that some of them still hold those who lived in them before. Perhaps she's right. And perhaps that is why Juliana never tried to follow that figure. Thank you very much for reading this, and thank you as well if you choose to share this story on Tales of the Night, because for my family, it represents the beginning of a series of experiences that, over time, would end up reaching all of us. Greetings from Veracruz, Mexico. Have a very good night.